I don't know about you, but life these days seems to be a never-ending list of bills to pay, whether it be the plumber for the leak, or the garden service for the stuff that needed to be done, or children's schooling, or doctor's bills, or teeth fixing, or whatever it seems to be. Everyone seems to want to make sure that we can pay. But that makes me feel really stressed. And I see it in my clients that our stress levels are rising more and more. We feel like we're in the middle of this Groundhog Day where every single month the money comes in and then poof, it disappears out. And before you know it, you're left juggling. You don't even get to make it through half the month before the money seems to disappear. And you're kind of starting to have to worry about how do you pay for the bills. You pick out your credit card that needs to carry over until next month. You just push some of the bills further. That roof that needs to be fixed never seems to get fixed because it just doesn't make it on the list. And all of that leads to an inordinate amount of stress. Now, here's the thing. In my book, Deep Grooves, I talked about this concept of good reasons and real reasons. And the fact that you are never able to resolve your issues with money until you are able to understand, or actually any issues, until you're able to understand what are the real reasons. We all focus on the good reasons. These are the things that we are able to convince other people are and even ourselves are the reasons for us doing something. And you can try and fix things at the good reason level, but until you uncover those real reasons, you will never be able to change your position. And so when I started exploring people's money, I've started to find this trend that for me is the real reason for money stress. And that reason is unpredictability. It doesn't matter how many people's money, and I'm going to show you a few, I come across. There is never a human being whose expenses are the same every single month. Nice and flat and wonderful. What ends up happening is that every single person that we come across seems to have this exact same thing, that there are months where their expenses are more than income, and it doesn't seem to matter how much they earn, whether earn a lot or earn less. Here's the thing, your money is never going to be the same, and when your money is not predictable, it's not the same every single month, you end up compensating by, you have these big months like over the Christmas period, etc. And then the beginning of the month ends up being so tight. And the reason for that is because you're having to cut back significantly to pay back the debt of those months where your expenses exceeded your income. And how do you pay for that? So that problem is exacerbated when your income is unpredictable. But because then you have two things going on at the same period of time. Your income is unpredictable as well as your expenses are unpredictable. And that unpredictability causes two things, either major stress or major hoarding of cash. And both of those lead to a lot of problems. So what we want to make sure is that we are able to really grasp that until you solve this problem of unpredictability in your expenses, you are always going to have stress. But here's the thing. In almost everyone's, all the examples that I look at, there actually is enough money in the entire year period. People have generally kind of scaled their lives to their expenses. The problem comes is in each individual month. And what tends to happen is that in those months where there is these gaps, we tend to actually spend into those gaps as opposed to preserving them for the months that are more difficult. So whilst we'd love more money, and let's be clear, all of us would like more money, it's not actually the underlying problem. It is a good reason, but not the real reason. The real reason, and I stress it again, I've seen it doesn't matter what income people are earning. I've seen it across the income scale. The real issue is that money is not predictable. And this is the big gripe that I have with budgets. What happens with budgets is that people end up looking at this whole year of expenses and then coming up with some random target that is an average of the 12 months. And here's the problem with that, is that you're never going to stick to a budget because our lives are always cyclical. And because our expenses are always cyclical, you're never going to spend according to this budget of setting a set amount every single month. And so I think that it is completely bizarre to randomly set one number that you're supposed to follow each month and stick to that budget. It is never going to work, ever. So you cannot do that. You need to make sure that you're dealing with the real issue, which is the unpredictability. You see, we are all creatures of habit. As much as we'd like to say we're not, our lives tend to follow a rhythm within a calendar year. And if you have children, that rhythm is determined by their school holidays. And if you're a grandparent, that seems to happen too. If you want to spend time with kids, the time you spend it is in the school holidays. So that already creates a major structure for a calendar year. The other thing that creates structure for our year and rhythms that are predictable is holidays. Things like Christmas, Easter, birthdays, if you get together for everybody's birthday. These things create rhythms and patterns that we can know and we can predict in our monthly expenses, because these things happen regularly every single year. And as many of you know, I do a lot of work with home helpers. I love working with them. They support a huge amount of people in South Africa. On average, a home helper will support 6 other people. And so they are really a deep passion for me to work with home helpers to improve their money. And when I say to them, so talk to me about the most stressful times of the year, they always say to me, it's Christmas. When we have to go back and be with our families and their presents and there's party and there's fun and there's food, it always costs a lot of money. Now, here's the thing. In a Southern Hemisphere country, Christmas is then followed by back to school. And so we always talk about January. You know, January is always a big thing because it's new school clothes, it's new stationery, it's new stuff. And that comes on the back of a very expensive Christmas. So I then ask them, and we have this giggle when I say to them, so tell me, did Christmas come last year? And they all go, yes. Did you have the same problem of back to school straight afterwards last year? And they all go, yes. And then I say, and did it come the year before? And they look at me and they go, yes. And then I look at them and I say, it's going to come this year and it's going to come next year. And you know it's going to come. So you don't need to have all of that stress, because we can act ahead of time when we can predict an expense that's going to come. The problem is we always don't estimate properly and trying to make kind of rationalizations in my brain that I'll get to saving for Christmas in November, but it doesn't happen. And that's the thing. We can pick up these rhythms in our own life, and we can then plan accordingly to make sure that in a year period, over a period of time, we are able to meet the needs that we have, and it then becomes far less stressful. So if I manage to convince you that first and foremost, your money is in fact more predictable than you think. Secondly, that within a year, these same patterns are going to repeat themselves. And you're generally not as short of money as you think you are, then it stands to reason that I can then give you a system that will help you meet those real reasons why it's a struggle to keep your money under control. Because I can enable you to both smooth your income if you have unpredictable income, but more importantly, understand and predict those expenses that are coming ahead, so that in times when there is that gap, you're able to stash the cash and create a system that allows you never to be caught by unpredictable expenses. And so the first step that we are going to undertake for the system is that it all starts with understanding the patterns. You have to know your patterns in order to be able to know what's going to happen in your expenses. And this is the thing that you need to start recognizing. You know, Is your money these occasional, like almost flat with occasional spikes? Is it up and down and all over the place? Is it kind of low first half of the year, bigger end half of the year? Or is the actual issue for you that although your expenses are pretty smooth, your income is all over the place? And only once you can start recognizing how your spending pattern looks, are you then able to look at it over this entire year and see what's happened. Now, I know that it takes a long time to put together 12 months of expenses. My clients have to do it when we do a financial plan, and that ends up often resulting in it taking at least 4 to 6 weeks to put this thing together. But I can tell you that even if you start with just 3 months and start tracking it, keep building that up to a year, that is far better than nothing at all. So you can use some of those tools like 22/7, Mint, all of those things that track and they start to learn how you categorize your expenses. It doesn't matter how you do it, just start to gather the information that you can build over a year's view of what these patterns are. Which leads me to then how you categorize your money. So for me, categorizing is a hugely important tool, and it helps us to think about our money in buckets that enable us to be more successful. And for me, I always make sure people categorize and separate first and foremost between needs and wants. And the real reason you need to separate between needs and wants is because for us to look at how much money you need in the future, our very first goal is that you have enough money to provide for your basic needs of food and shelter, etc., and that you never, ever, ever are going to rely on your children or anybody else in order to cover yourself. The other categories, I guess, depend on who you are. So for those of us who have children, that's a separate category, pre-retirement. And if you are pre-retirement, obviously saving is a category. Once you retire, you don't need to save, and hopefully your children and all the other debt is off your payroll. And then between needs and wants, we explore things like holidays, travel, all of that stuff. And also explore for me is around creating a happy human being. And that for many people, it's actually not travel. It could be lifelong learning. It could be, supporting cats, whatever it is. And that also then brings us to give. And when we retire, those categories change, and literally it then becomes the 4 needs, wants, explore, give, because you wouldn't have debt and you also shouldn't have children that you support, which makes it easier. But as I said, that categorization for me is much more about the mindfulness. Now, I've just redone my whole entire planning system because I think I used to subscribe to the budget, and so built a budget system, and have now worked with my clients to create this forecasting system. And for me, I think a forecasting system is a far stronger value proposition than a budget because, as I said, it helps us to deal with the reality of life. So you can get that on my website, lisalinfield.com/tracker. And it also has this whole forecasting system, embedded into it. But before we get to that forecasting system, which is step 3, I want to talk about the second thing, which is mindfulness. Now, I often see people going about this process and avoiding it because they know they're going to beat themselves up. And I can tell you one thing for free. There is never learning in the presence of criticism. If you want to change your money, and to have a much more predictable set of money and a set of money that you actually understand, you have to be mindful. And in being mindful, you cannot sit and criticize yourself or criticize your wife or husband or whoever else is part of your budget. You have to be able to just observe. Observe how you justify your expenses as you write them down. Observe what it makes you feel like when you see that money in the month is more than the income. Observe what are those conversations that are going on in your head. And it is in those observations and in those understanding of how you're thinking at the time that can you then dig down into the real way you think about your money. And one of the big observations that I talk about in episode 147 is this whole thing about the unbelievable insight that your bank balance and your calendar, in fact, give you into what your real value system is. We all say we have a value system, and we'd love to believe that we listen to that value system. But what in actual fact happens is that we live our lives spending our time and our money in a way that often isn't as congruent. And particularly as we get more and more money and less is going on just basic survival. And so it gives you unbelievable insight as to what's truly going on in your life and in your marriage. Which leads me to the third thing, which is now that we can forecast forward. Once we have looked at our actuals and we've really kind of thought about it and understood it, we can look at how it is that we are going to change our trajectory, or at least manage and plan for that trajectory. And so that brings me to the steps that we're going to take. And the first one is that we need to start with last year's actuals. Now, because you're a creature of habit, this actually isn't so hard to do. Forecasting is very easy because you've already got last year's actuals. So effectively, you can copy and paste it and start again. My particular system brings it in. And the first thing that you do is use that as your base. We are creatures of habit. We are consistent in our behavior, and we are at least follow the patterns and rhythms of our year. The next thing is that you then make adjustments. And in making adjustments, it's because we know some things already of what's going to happen next month, towards the end of the year, etc., that were different to this last year. So if your rent went up by 400, you're not going to use last year's rent. You're going to use the rent that you know and anticipate that in the middle of the year it's going to go up again, because every single year it seems to happen. If you know your child's going to a more expensive high school, or you know, for example, that there is a big birthday party, or that you're going away to see your in-laws for Christmas, then add that in, because those are expenses that won't have been the same as last year. And then be realistic, not hopefully optimistic. When people have an issue, they always seem to just lower the numbers and then hope it's going to squish into place. And don't give in to that temptation. Make sure that you are ruthless about really knowing what it is that a realistic life is going to cost you. And this often brings up the conversation that I have with people, which is, do you have an income problem or do you have an expense problem? Sometimes your expenses are tight and you can't drop them anymore, and therefore you have an income problem. Either one of you needs to go out to work, or you need to start a side hustle or something. But you can only address this issue once you are brutally honest with the real reasons about it. It is hugely important that we don't choose budgets. We don't choose one number for an entire year when we know we're never going to be able to stick to it. That we actually use these tools of forecasting. So the next thing that you then need to do is to track your actuals against your forecast. Now, even if it's just that you're just forecasting 3 months out or 6 months out, you need to track your actuals against it, because it does 4 things. And these 4 things are hugely important. It starts to train your brain to look ahead and to start to anticipate the expenses. And even in that process, you then start to be much more mindful of your money today, because you're continuously looking a few months out. The next thing is that it trains you to be far better at estimating what things really cost, and as opposed to kind of just not even knowing, really. And that mindfulness makes one much more intentional about how we buy, where we spend, and what's important to us. And then it also makes us mindful in that actual shopping process to kind of know that this thing isn't as worth it as something else, and that you start to trade back naturally because you want to create space for this amazing event that's coming up. And it also gives you a heads up of if there's going to be a rough time that's coming ahead. Now, I have to share with you in the spirit of honesty, about 17 years ago, when John and I were renovating our very first house, you get all these quotes. So you get the quotes for the builders and the tilers and the kitchen people and all these other things. And then curtains, oh my goodness, curtains cost an absolute fortune. And you get all these quotes and you sign off and you agree And then somewhere through the process, you lose concept of the money because it feels like these things are just so big. So you agree to things and you keep going, and we found ourselves in that position. Anyway, we took a weekend break out to my godfather, and as we were driving, a quote came in on the email, and I looked at it, and I don't know what made me think, and I scratched around in the bag. John was driving, and I got a piece of paper, and I sat there and I scribbled all the things I knew were coming and when they were coming. Because whilst you pay a deposit for some things, you don't for everything, and you don't pay the whole amount. And I sat there and I went month by month by month as John drove, and I looked, we were in February, and I looked at this and I realized that in May we were going to absolutely hit a wall of all proportions, because that was when much of the money was coming due. And at the same time in June, July, we were getting extra payments, bonuses, but we were going to have a cash flow issue for that 1 month where we weren't having that money coming in, and all these things were due. Now, because I was forecasting and looking ahead, which I literally hadn't done, except that this complete panic arose for some unknown reason, I had 3 months in which to deal and make changes that came towards that issue. So I was able to delay some payments. We were able to delay some work. We were able to put stuff on hold. Like, it didn't matter if we didn't have curtains for the first 2 months we lived in our house. We could have them in the 3rd month, no problem, because we didn't want to get ourselves into a position where we had to use debt for a short-term cash flow issue. And that's what forecasting enables you to do, is it gives you more time to change course and direction to where you need to be. And it's in that forecasting, in that tracking, in that mindfulness, and in this constant readjustment as you track your actuals against, that you are then able to course correct. And I guess for me, that's why forecasting is a far better tool than budgeting. Which brings me to that last bit, which is stashing the cash. Now, I am a huge fan of little savings accounts that are attached to your main transactional account that enables you to stash the cash for the future. I call these little things, these little accounts, expense smoothers. And I believe that they are truly the answer to being able to close that gap between a budget and reality, between what this ideal flatline should be and what this reality of our lives actually is. And these little savings accounts enable us to make sure that we prepare for things like the holidays to come. So one of the things that I always laugh at is when you speak to people and you say, how much does Christmas cost? And let's use a number that's easy, 12,000 Rand. So you say, okay, and what is in your budget? And the budget has 1,000 Rand. Why? Because 1,000 divided by 12, that's, 1,000 Rand a month that's going towards that. And I say to them, okay, it's October, month 10. Do you have 10,000 Rand saved up for holiday? And they look at me and they go, nope. And I say, well, theoretically, you need to have saved the stuff aside. But because they haven't put it aside and they've kept it in their bank account, they've used it. And we do as human. It's not because they're bad and we're good. It's because as human natures, we observe this thing called Parkinson's law. And Parkinson's law basically says we will stretch and fill the space that we have. So if I ask you to do a project and I want it delivered in a year, you'll probably wake up in month 11 and do the project. If I ask it in 6 months, you will do it in 6 months. If I ask it in a month, you'll do it in a month. And if I ask you for a view on it in a week, you will have a view on it in a week. We expand to fit the space available. And we do the same for our money. And this is the real challenge that we face, is that our money is, when we leave it in our bank account and we don't have specific plans in place for it, and we're not clearly thinking forward, we're just trying to survive this month, we end up tending to spend the money. And in episode 208, I look at this whole thing of how you can use Parkinson's law to your favor. And one of them is you put these expense smoothers, these little savings accounts in place, and it's March, you put your 1,000 Rand towards that holiday in place, and you actually put it into your savings account. You take it away from your current account. It's not your money to spend. Why? Because if you don't, you're going to end up with a massive amount of debt later on, which you're going to have to pay more money. And your 12,000 Rand holiday becomes a 14,000 Rand holiday because you're trying to pay the bank back for all of that interest. Which brings me to the last summary that I wanted to kind of take you through. Is if you embrace this process, you are absolutely able to do it. All of us are able to do it. Why? Because it doesn't require any rocket science. Literally, step one, look and find the patterns. That does require you to sit and go back and record or build up over time 12 months worth of expenses. But once you have that first 12 months, you just copy and paste and use it the next year as the basis for your forecast going forward. In fact, I keep a rolling 12-month period of time, actually probably more like quarters, where I keep looking forward so that I don't get to December and go, oh my goodness, there's January, or tax year end is February, oh my goodness, there's suddenly March. Is you need to keep constantly looking forward. And that starts with step one, which is understanding what your expenses are. Step two is making sure that you're mindful in this process. This isn't just a thing of like write down the numbers, see what pops out. This is around saying, why did we spend that much? Why did I offer to pay for the bill when in actual fact we could have split it? Why didn't we do this? Why didn't I save? How did I justify that spending? So mindfulness is the second most important thing. And the reason why is that until you change your thinking, you won't change your behavior. And thirdly, as I said, is forecasting. Look forward, adjust, predict. Make sure that when you know expenses come, you're continuously refining. Really one expects that the 3 months ahead would be quite tight and quite closer to budget, and then the next 3 months a bit less, and the next 3 months, etc. The further out is more difficult. But those big milestones of holidays, kids' school fees, things like that are big milestones of money, you then can use that. And then tracking those actuals. This is a monthly process. I always say, set aside 1 hour a month, put it in your diary, calendar, make that little recurring appointment, and make sure that you're spending that 1 hour a month just to track your actuals. And in the process, again, be mindful about it to see what is it that I thought would happen? Why didn't that happen? Why didn't I spend? Is that money just something that's going to be shifted over to next month? And lastly, stash the cash. Go and set up these expense smoothies, these little cash accounts, savings accounts. And the reason why it is a savings account is because you expect it to use it in a year. You're going to build up that money for the holiday, then you use it. Then, you start again, build it up, use it. Any expenses that are not monthly recurring expenses, you make sure that you then stash that cash. Download the free forecaster and tracker on lieselinfield.com/tracker, and don't forget to subscribe to the YouTube channel.